Thank you for joining us today for the second talk that is taking place in the frame of Haegue Yang's exhibition, Several Reenactments, is currently at S.M.A.K. The goal of these public talks and lectures that unfold the exhibition is to explore her multifaceted practice, her creative path, and the lines she draws in the exhibition at S.M.A.K. With three public talks and lectures that follow the same logic of doubling inherent to the exhibition, we wish to pair and bring together international museum scholars and curators. For the second talk today, we are deeply honored to welcome Christine Mehring, curator of David and Alfred Smart Museum of Art and professor at the University of Chicago, as well as Yilmaz Dziewior, director of the Museum Ludwig in Cologne. Welcome, Christine and Yilmaz, and thank you for having accepted our invitation. Also, on behalf of S.M.A.K, we wish to thank Haegue Yang for presence today in Ghent. I also want to indicate that this event is live streamed and also wish to thank our online audience to take time to attend and witness this event. Taking into account the concept of the paired lecture, the first 40-minute presentation you're about to hear is by Christine Mehring, whom I'll introduce in a moment. After Christine's presentation, there will be an opportunity to ask a few questions, also for our online audience. I also wish to thank our technician and also Hildegard, who is our volunteer present with us today, and she will be moderating questions for the ones who are connected via the live stream. After that, the second presentation will be by Yilmaz Dziewior, and we have also foreseen a moment for you to ask questions if you wish. So I will briefly introduce Christine. Christine is a Mary L. Block Professor of Art History at the University of Chicago and Associate Faculty in its Department of Visual Arts. Her research focuses on abstraction, particularly the ways in which non-mimetic forms, colors, and non-traditional materials come to signify within historical context, post-war European art, especially the impact of World War II and transatlantic relations. The crossovers between art and design, including interior and furniture design, wall painting, and public art and photography, and the relations between old and new media. Together with architectural historian Sean Keller, she's working on a book about the art and architecture of the Munich Olympics. Her exhibition, Monochrome Multitudes, co-curated with Orianna Cacchione and featuring two works, including a new commission by Haegue Yang, was on view at the David and Alfred Smart Museum of Art at the University of Chicago in fall 2022. In 2020, she curated the university's commission of alumna Jenny Alzer's first augmented reality app, You Be My Ally. Her recent essays focus on the art of Ted Stam in the first monograph of the artist published by A.J. Kans, Walter De Maria in a monograph published by Rizzoli and Gagosian Gallery on the Panza Collection Initiative for Art Forum, and also on Donald Judd's Art and Design for MoMA's retrospective. Welcome, Christine, and I pass you the mic.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Is this on? All good? Yes, you can hear me? All right. It's such an honor to be here. Thank you, Karima, for inviting me. Thank you, Haegue, for coming. I can't believe you made it here for this. Also want to thank my co-curator, Orianna Cacchione, who can't be here, who together with our mutual friend, Haegue Yang, who's a collector, introduced me to Haegue's work, which is so much up my alley in terms of all the things that Karima just talked about. In terms of abstraction, my interest in design, historical meanings of colors and materials. It's just been such a joy to get to know Haegue's work over the last years. And then thank you, Yilmaz, for joining me here today. It's very, very exciting to meet you and be here with you. So I'll talk for about 35, 40 minutes. And roughly in 3 parts, just to orient you a little bit. The first part, I'll talk a little bit about the Monochrome Multitudes exhibition, which closed in January this year, and the 2 pieces by Haegue Yang that were in that exhibition. And that's going to sort of lay the groundwork for one aspect of Haegue Yang's work that I want to talk about, which is this notion of quasi. I say it the German way because I think that's how Haegue Yang encounters the word. Of course, it's Latin and runs through all sorts of languages. I'll talk about that. So I'll talk about Haegue Yang's kind of quasi-art historical engagements in the second part. And then in the third part, a little bit shorter, talk a little bit about the meaning of quasi and broader meanings in Haegue Yang's work more generally. Okay, so I'll start with Monochrome Multitudes. This is Haegue Yang's installation, a commission for the Smart Museum on the occasion of that exhibition. And the exhibition that was also a separate exhibition that Haegue did in the lobby. It was called Quasi-Legit. So 2022, as Karima just mentioned. And it was a standalone exhibition as part of a series of so-called thresholds exhibitions that are taking place in the lobby always for 2 years at the Smart Museum. And so this is the lobby of the museum that you see here. And the title of the work, that is the blind piece that you see here on the blue wall, which I talk quite a bit about. The title of the work itself is Sol LeWitt Upside Down onto Wall, Modular Wall Structure expanded 20 times. And as I mentioned, this is commissioned for the museum. So I want to talk a little bit just briefly about sort of where this work fit in the exhibition. Yeah, you had warned me this might not work. So next one, please. Do I have to point it somewhere else? Here we go. Okay, perfect. So basically the exhibition was structured through 2 different types of rooms. So it's an exhibition about monochrome art and revisiting monochrome art kind of beyond the sort of male painting focused 20th century Western context that most people who are interested in 20th century modern art think about when they think about monochrome art. So there were monochrome rooms, pretty clear here, a black room, a gray room, red, blue, white, yellow, etc. And then next one, please. Thematic rooms, a little bit more surprising, perhaps one about the monochrome, one about bunt, one about the body, about from pigment to pixel, one about walls, and one about sound. And the idea here was, in some sense, a very pedagogical one. I teach a lot of abstract art. Abstract art is very hard to understand for many of my students, for many people. And what I often do is I show them, 3 yellow works next to one another, and people immediately see the differences. Or I show them 3 works that look very different, and I say, like, well, let's figure out how they're similar. And this basically was the sort of operating principle of the exhibition. To have people not have to read so much, but actually see what these very abstract, seemingly inaccessible works are about. And in some ways, I want to say this is a kind of very Haegue Yang principle. Yang works very much in a serial fashion, right? She keeps bringing back kind of similar vocabulary, similar works, installing them in different contexts, etc. The S.M.A.K show is called Reenactments, very, very key kind of operating principle in her work, I think. And then likewise, also, it was very much a Haegue Yang exhibition in the sense that she very often engages with kind of very central art historical paradigms and artists and kind of revisits them. That's basically what we were doing. So she was really kind of a linchpin for this exhibition. Can I have the next one, please? So while her work wasn't in these rooms, all the artists we included, we always wanted to show them, we wanted to make sure that they could have fit into lots of other rooms. That made it clear that they should be in the exhibition. Yang's Sol LeWitt Upside Down piece with the white blinds was an obvious dialogue with the white room. Next one, please. I'm going to go through quite a bit quickly now. The pseudo Klein Blue wall, which I'll talk about in a second, of course, very much in dialogue with the Blue Room. In the front here, you see Yves Klein's blue table with the pigment. We'll come back to this. Next one, please. Likewise, her work with the wall, and of course, that's also a central feature of the exhibition upstairs, which I absolutely love. Very much in dialogue also with the room on walls. So here you have a view into the wall room with the Dan Peterman commission, which was the other artist commission that we did for the show in the front. And here you see the kind of soaring wall in this Edward Larrabee Barnes building lobby that Haegue Yang's wall painting really, really brought out the architecture beautifully. And I love the way that it reflected on the wall. That's a white wall there above the lights, but it kind of got a blue tint through this intensely luminous blue. Next one, please. And then Yang's Cinnamon series, which we borrowed from Haegue Yang Cho collector I mentioned earlier, was in the room From Pigment to Pixel, together with the Tobias Rehberger piece, Felix Gonzalez Torres, Wade Guyton, and a few others. So the other aspect of this exhibition, and this is where I'm going to begin to slowly turn to Haegue Yang's work, there were three kind of key aspects to the show. One was that we wanted to expand thinking about the monochrome as not just being about painting, but being about materials, media. All sorts of media, photography, film, etc. We wanted to expand geographically beyond the Western canon. And we wanted to expand the types of meanings and ways in which we think about monochrome art, which is so kind of confined to thinking about, perception, medium specificity, and modernism. And we wanted to think about ways in which the monochrome could be engaged through questions of gender, culture, race, etc. Next one, please. So I'll just give you three other examples, non-Haegue Yang examples for these three different aspects. So for example, for the material media expansion, we made a centerpiece of the exhibition, this amazing work by Claire Zeisler from the museum's collection, which is a triptych, which is knotted wool, as you can see here in the detail, very obviously in dialogue with Alexander Rodchenko's so-called last painting, red, yellow, and blue. So we actually didn't show these kind of canonical works. We showed works in dialogue with canonical works, as it were. Can I have the next one, please? Oh, sorry. So that was also very much a work that was about the centrality of craft, fiber artists working in the 1960s onwards, etc. We wanted to show a Chicago artist, Claire Zeisler, had been associated with the Chicago Bauhaus. And we love the way this kind of unruly wool kind of hit the floor. Second theme, and so we also had, as I said, film, computer-based art, photography, all the things that we don't usually think about with respect to monochrome art, in addition to craft and design. So second one, we wanted to expand geographically, as I mentioned. So here you have Makyusha, a piece made from pantyhose that's stretched over concrete shards. We had, because of Orianna's amazing expertise in East Asian art, a lot of artists from Asia. Also Latin America. We're now working on a book where we also really want to look at Africa and the Middle East. The pantyhose here, very strong identity association. Makyusha very much has these memories of her mother wearing pantyhose and looking up as she was small onto her mother's legs and wearing these stockings. Also very much associated with sex workers. So you get the idea of these sort of materials really having strong meanings and of kind of bringing artists from unexpected contexts in terms of the monochrome, the Western monochrome, into this exhibition. Very much in dialogue here, in this case, with Majewicz's Black Square. Okay, next one. And then lastly, this meanings of materials that we very much emphasized, always in juxtaposition, often with more canonical works. So here's an Ed Reinhardt black painting together with Theaster Gates' tar painting. Theaster Gates working with tar in memory of his father, who was a roofer working with tar, very much associated with black housing on the south side of Chicago, redlining, etc. But we wanted to, through these juxtapositions, also soften some of these very, very strong identity meanings and actually bring out the way someone like Theaster actually also works formally. And in almost an homage to this juxtaposition, he was very honored to be shown next to Ed Reinhardt and actually be seen in a context that was in dialogue with Western modernism and not always reduced to his identity. He titled his painting, which had been untitled when we chose it for the show, Black Seam Formal Practice, like emphasizing this formal aspect. Next one, please. Now we get into Haegue Yang. So here are the two pieces that we had of hers. And I mentioned earlier, I really began to think of her work as a kind of linchpin in terms of these three themes. So first of all, material and media diversity. Yang is fiercely inventive, I think, in terms of media and working with found materials. As you see in the show and beyond, blinds, light bulbs, bells, racks, security envelopes. The work on the right is part of her spice sheet series, which is made from cinnamon spice, a very unwieldy, powdery substance that she's, I want to almost say, forces into very neat abstract patterns, reminiscent of 50s geometric abstraction. I'll come back to that. An abstraction that therefore becomes resonant with spice trade networks. And that she kind of flattens, abstracts this unruly substance, but also brings out the differences of these different types of cinnamon. I mean, whoever thought that cinnamon comes in all of these different kinds of reddish browns, right? And connoisseurs of cinnamon can identify where a cinnamon comes from, where it was sourced based on these colors. I can't. I'll come back to this. So, and then the material of blinds, of course, which I think is a very, very strongly historically resonant material that I've gotten very, very interested in. There's, of course, the relationship to the monochrome in terms of a Western conception of painting that monochrome painters very much denied, right? So Western painting was always about opening up a world, a window onto the world, and the blind in Haegue Yang's work is very much kind of evoking that. But then they're, of course, semi-opaque. They're almost these kind of transitional pieces between the Western conception of painting as a window and the monochrome that denies that kind of view onto the world. But then also more broadly resonant with transparency, opacity, seeing, and blinding as embedded in the English word of the blind, of course. So that was the first reason why Yang's work was absolutely central here. Second one was our interest in multi or transnational practices. Yang works between Seoul and Germany and Berlin and Frankfurt. And I was really fascinated, especially last year, seeing her exhibition in Copenhagen, how much her work is often about or has been about learning the German culture, German way of life. I'm so puzzled and confused always by her website, Haegue Yang. There's something very beautiful, but also very violent about turning her name into a different nation's language's name. I can never imagine doing that with my name. And making that the kind of representation online of her work. And Haegue Yang's very much engaged, I think, still in learning Western art history. Something that resonates a little bit with me because I grew up in Germany, so very much part of the West, but went to the US to learn about American art, which I didn't know. And so this idea of kind of having to kind of do the hard work of learning another culture and another culture's art is very important to me. And there's the multi-transnational kind of interests that resonate in her work, of course, with the cinnamon and interest in colonialism and the spice trade, et cetera. But then especially with the blinds, I think there's so many different words and names used for blinds, right, in different languages. So Venetian blinds, indeed, they came from Persia. Were imported by Italian merchants into Europe. So there's that kind of transnational kind of resonance in that material of the blind already. Then the Germans use the word jalousien, which is a French word, and comes from the French jealousy, and often used in the context of the sort of screening of women from view in the Middle East. So this material just like begins to have these touchstones across the globe, it seems. Very, very central aspect of her work, I think. And then thirdly, the expansion of meanings in her work. This is really what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the talk, like ways in which Haegue Yang uses materials and references to other Western artists in ways that are historically or culturally meaningful, sometimes even have political resonances. And I want to do that through this notion of the term quasi, a sort of, but not fully, part of modernism, abstraction, the ready-made, Western art history, etc. Next one, please. And this is, of course, just the last word on this, very central also to the S.M.A.K exhibition, the centrality of the sculptures, the sonic sculptures using bells. And the context here, actually, and I'm not going to go so much into this, very much a dialogue also with ancient, prehistoric, indigenous, non-Western cultures. And in the context of the bells, really a material that actually Western and non-Western cultures very much share, which is important. And then also on the walls, the pieces, the trustworthies, working with the patterns and security envelopes that Haegue Yang uses to make these beautiful collages, very much about sensitive information traveling across distances. So again, you have in a kind of abstract material and pattern embedded this kind of dialogue and dialogue across cultures. Okay, next one, please. So want to just briefly show you where this quasi-Klein Blue comes from. So as I mentioned, the Smart exhibition installation in the lobby was called quasi-legit. And there's something important about the quasi-legit here in terms of Haegue Yang's relationship to the art historical canon in the West, I think. It's on the one hand, serious. It's for her, I think, and in the work, it's a kind of ever ongoing effort to make space for herself as a Korean-born artist in a Western canon, and as a woman in a still largely male canon, as much as we're all trying to change that. So it's serious, but there's also always something very sanguine and very playful about it. And the term quasi-legit is really central here, I think. Kind of street lingo, right? At least in English, like legit, like legitimate. And then through my daughters watching German kiddie news, I really began to realize quasi has become this like total hip word among the German youth in the last 4 or 5 years. And so the kind of quasi-legit has this playful connotation, I think, in the German culture in the last 5 years or so, maybe even longer. Okay, so the quasi-Klein Blue that you see in the exhibition upstairs comes from Yves Klein's blue. So Yves Klein, very important 20th century monochrome artist, very famously proclaimed to have invented the monochrome and also to have patented his Yves Klein blue, this very particular, very luminescent ultramarine blue. And in the exhibition upstairs, and also for our exhibition, and first in the Screen of Tali exhibition that Haegue Yang did a few years ago, she used this quasi-Klein blue. And for the S.M.A.K show and ours, and one others parallel to ours, she directed staff in the museum to source paints close to Yves Klein's blue from local hardware stores, and then directed the staff of the museum to vote on the closest match. And I'll show you a little bit about that. Next one, please. So this was the exhibition parallel to ours in Busan. Next one. So here's some paint samples. So of course, a very diligent art historian that I was, I wanted to really make sure we got this very, very close to Yves Klein Blue. I took this very, very seriously. I went to hardware stores for months beforehand and started collecting all of these samples and brought them as we were beginning to, have discussions about this. And our installers had already started buying some paint. And so we had 5 samples. Those were the samples we could use. All of my amazing sourcing had been useless. So we ended up having 5 tones. And the S.M.A.K brochure describes this process as absurd and precarious, which really resonated with me. And it's really true that it is both absurd and precarious, and was for us. Absurd in the sense that it's, of course, completely pseudoscientific. This kind of semi-contract, you've been given these instructions, you kind of feel like, the good German that I am, I thought I had to follow the instructions very, very directly and closely. But of course, there's no real consequence to this. There's no verification. you know, it wasn't like Haegue Yang was going to check on us and say, no, you did this wrong. She really left it to us. And so collectively, we're kind of literally replacing the master artist vision, both Yves Klein's and in some sense Haegue Yang's as well, right? But then also very precarious and to me still very serious. Like art making by consensus is a terrible way to make art, and curating by consensus is a terrible way to make an exhibition. But that's what we kind of, I mean, we it's not like we had to debate, but you know, it ended up a little bit of a debate, even though we were all voting and the majority, you know, got their way in the end. So as I said, I took these instructions very seriously and kind of kept reminding everybody that we had a responsibility to the artists to really do this right. And I felt that I was right because I knew Yves Klein's work best. And I see a lot of Yves Klein Blue here in the room, like shoes, jackets, kind of, I like that. I should have worn that. So I took it seriously and I schlepped in a whole bunch of books, knowing, of course, that these are all not reproducing Yves Klein Blue particularly well either. And I was really adamant that one was the right one. And that's not the one that won. I was kind of upset, and to the point where I said, but my vote should count more than other people's votes because I know Yves Klein's blue. And the moment I said that, you know, still resonating with our horrible elections in the United States, I shut up and realized that that was maybe not a good way to go. So we went with the blue that wasn't an Yves Klein blue. So next one. Then, of course, because we had the blue pigment table coming, I brought the samples back. And of course I was right, but that didn't matter. So what I'm getting at here is that this process has something to do with democracy actually not being about expertise. It's about every vote counting. It's all embedded in this lobby installation, which is incredible, I think. So the quasi is, of course, not about the actual Yves Klein Blue. That's already very clear from the quasi Klein Blue. It's a pseudo statistic, as Haegue Yang's description actually says, and it's a fake Yves Klein Blue. Okay, next one. So want to show you briefly. Let me actually skip this. Sorry. What I love about Haegue Yang's work and what I'm going to talk about now is the way she's engaging with art history and modernism and actually showing us, especially us art historians, modernism in a different way and begins to see things that we haven't seen that are kind of blind spots in art history. And these quasi engagements with these central modern artists are important for that. So Yves Klein actually very much about quasi himself. So he claimed to have invented the monochrome. He didn't. He probably knew that, but he still, you know, claimed it anyway. Very facetious artist, claiming originality, invention, firstness, etc. This is his booklet where he's kind of claiming to have made these monochromes really, really early on. Next one, please. Klein also exhibiting very famously here in the Galleria Apollinaire in 1957, identical blue monochromes that he's selling at different prices because they're actually different paintings, which they're not, but maybe they are. So very much in dialogue with the market pressures, New York having famously stolen the idea of modern art and kind of trying to kind of foreground the market dynamics in the relationship to abstraction. Next one. Likewise, also, you know, Klein claiming to have in the late 40s composed the monotone silence symphony years before John Cage. Very, very suspicious. And I think he very famously kind of predated his works. And by the way, we staged the monochrome monotone silence symphony as a closing event for the exhibition with Haegue Yang's work in the background here. Okay, so quasi for Haegue Yang is a kind of artistic rereading of art history, but the kind of art history and the kind of artists that are always already quasi somehow in themselves. And Haegue Yang kind of becomes a kind of quasi art historian in the context of relooking and revisiting this art history. It's very much an artistic take that also to me has art historical implications and actual insights. So this is not quasi legit. This is to me very legitimate. So she's locating aporias, gaps, oversights, blind spots, unresolved problems, nuances in the history of modernism that we haven't seen. And in some sense, kind of saving artworks from the canonical confines in which we art historians kind of like to put things, Yves Klein, monochrome reinvention after the war, et cetera. And so Haegue Yang's bringing out in her revisiting of these artists, aspects of these artists' work that we haven't paid attention to. Next one, please. And so one thing for me here that's probably somewhat unintentional was that the kinds of blues that you get in a hardware store tend to be sort of have a shine, right, and a sheen. This one very much, you see the reflection of the blinds here in this detail shot. That's not what Klein is about at all. He's very much about the kind of mattness and opacity, and kind of as a kind of violation to the Yves Klein blue by having this sheen there. Likewise, in the Belle's kind of carpet upstairs, that sheen is very important. And so she's kind of really putting her finger on the kind of importance, not just of color in the monochrome, but of the paint quality here. Next one. Another blind spot in modernism is the deep engagement, of course, with design, the decorative arts and craft, which, as I mentioned, runs through the exhibition. But also was really something that we very happily embraced as something that kind of was foregrounded in the installation of Young's work in the lobby by the fact that we have these Louis Sullivan screens from the Chicago Stock Exchange in the doors that actually flanked Haegue Yang's installation here. You see the screen there? There it is installed at MoMA. We have ours actually kind of in the wall. And so there's very much a dialogue here between two sets of screens, right? And from the 19th century all the way into the 21st century that I thought was a really, really beautiful juxtaposition. So here again, also in the context of wall painting, all the way from Kandinsky to Stiel, very much a medium that was embraced by modernism, but also one that people were very, very careful and hesitant about because abstraction was always bordering on the wallpaper and maybe not being art enough anymore. Next one. So we've also really embraced this kind of role of design in the context of the exhibition more broadly and kind of reinserted it back into Haegue Yang's exhibition, mini exhibition with us in the lobby. So you see the font here that was actually the exhibition font overall, a font called Palermo. After the artist Blinky Palermo, and a font that was created as an artwork and a font by the artist Joe Scanlon. And of course, because of its dialogue with other artists, it's very much kind of a parallel enterprise to Haegue Yang's work, but also was one that was important to us because we wanted to kind of foreground the role of design in the context of abstraction and modernism. Next one, please. So we used the font, but then also exhibited the font as a kind of alphabet on the wall in the section about the monochrome. Here's the Blinky Palermo work that the letters are all made out of. They're kind of cut up and jumbled up and reassembled. Next one. And then the Palermo kind of gave us an additional kind of, I think, dialogue parallel to Haegue Yang's engagement of the blue and the Yves Klein blue, because Palermo very much also worked with this blue. All of these other aspects, though, parallel to Haegue's work in the lobby. The Blue Triangle by Palermo is a very participatory artwork. You are instructed to use the stencil to paint a blue triangle over the wall, which we did over there, and then we exhibited the stencil as well. In that context, also very much a work that is in dialogue with blue as a color that is associated with Romanticism ever since Novalis. But then also associated with spirituality because of Kandinsky's kind of association of blue and the triangle, right? So all of this very much something bringing out these additional meanings in Haegue Yang's lobby. Next one. Do I have like 5 minutes, Karima? Yeah, okay. So I want to just speed through a little bit sort of many other kind of art historical engagements in Haegue Yang's work. So first of all, most importantly, of course, Sol LeWitt, American conceptual artist, that is literally part of the title of her work, Sol LeWitt Upside Down onto Wall, Modular Wall Structure Expanded 20 times, to remind you. And here on the right, you have the LeWitt sculpture from the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. that it actually refers to. refers to is not quite the word, that it is quasi-ing, turning into a verb. So LeWitt, a conceptual artist, conceptual art very famously always talked about as very idea-driven, execution doesn't matter, etc. That's really not true. Like LeWitt had instructions for his wall paintings, and yes, others could execute it, but that's a kind of exception in his work. It's actually very, very important that all of his work was made, and that you see it unfold, as absurd as the kind of underlying logic of the works actually are. And the execution of the work, of LeWitt's work, the execution of the ideas actually brings out this kind of absurdity, as someone like Rosalind Krauss has very beautifully argued about LeWitt's work. And that is something that I think this kind of absurdity is something that Haegue Yang brings out in her revisiting of Sol LeWitt. So first of all, of course, by using blinds without windows, blinds that are kind of semi-transparent and you can see through the blue, onto the blue, and the blue wall kind of becomes the world. It's a kind of very absurd, but also at the same time very beautiful, evocative kind of way of seeing and not seeing. And then, of course, in the way that she's actually also breaking, echoing the modularity, but also breaking the modularity, because of course the blinds have a kind of orientation, unlike the very famously modular structure. The old notion of a modular is that you can turn it around and do whatever with it. You can't do that. Like the blinds are hanging down, they need gravity, right? And then, of course, because they're hanging down from this very dominant bar, there's only this one orientation, and it's not even a proper grid anymore because you have these very strong horizontal lines. Next one. Briefly wanted to mention, I won't talk about it even though I'm here in Ghent in Belgium. I think the first use of quasi is in Haegue Yang's work is quasi-MB in the middle of its story from 2006, which refers to Marcel Brother's film La Pluie. From 1969, and I won't talk about it, but she assumes the identity of Marcel Brother's, converses with him, ventriloquizes him. Sort of very similar kind of engagement. Actually, important about the film, one thing I want to say is that the rain starts falling and kind of wipes out what Marcel Brother's writes. And there's a kind of inherent abstraction and a kind of silencing of speech that is very central to Haegue Yang's work that is kind of enacted in that film as well. Next one. So here I want to show you how works like the Spice series are very much in dialogue with mid-century abstraction, a kind of ostensibly neutral, objective kind of abstract art. Here's a couple of prints by Max Bill. There's so many others one could show. Ostensible neutrality, because these are actually, at this point, certainly in time, deeply associated with their period. They very much have a period color, period forms, very much about that moment in the 50s of Reconstruction, economic miracle all over Western Europe, etc. So there's a way in which when Haegue Yang makes these kinds of mid-century geometric abstractions out of cinnamon and brings in these kind of colonial meanings of her abstract patterns, that she's bringing out, having us kind of revisit this mid-century abstraction and begin to see similar historical connotations and meanings in abstract forms. Next one, please. Likewise here, dialogue, I think, Haegue Yang will probably tell me I'm wrong, dialogue with Vladimir Tatlin's Monument to the Third International. It's a very huge, large-scale work that was exhibited in Copenhagen last year that turns, these blinds, these circles turn, very much like Tatlin's monument was meant to turn daily, monthly, and yearly, if I remember correctly. Likewise here, Lisitsky's abstract cabinet, also made of these sort of quasi-blind works, right? And you look at it from different sides and they change color. Next one, please. And there's something about the kind of quiet way in which these blinds turned that actually really brings out that kind of sadness of the failed utopias associated with a work like Tatlin's, for example, that we're beginning to see now, but for the longest time wasn't really visible to us, I think. Then here, for me, a very strong engagement with Marcel Duchamp's bottle rack, first ready-made very famously, with the clothes drying racks that Haegue Yang made here in the piece called Gymnastics of the Foldable from 2006, which actually exists as in the form of photographs of these different configurations of the drying rack. And then the drying rack becomes a kind of very important piece of her vocabulary ever since. And here too, I think what she's bringing out is something about Duchamp's ready-made that we haven't fully taken account of. And again, like I think of Haegue Yang a little bit as an art historian saying like, yeah, you don't quite have this right yet. The first ready-made, industrially made, this is all this is about. This is very much a domestic object, right? And like we're often losing track of that. So domestic objects very much associated with women and the household, and the clothes drying rack in relationship to this kind of, to me, brings something like that out, and that it's actually not like a fully kind of hardcore fully industrially made object. It's kind of between the kind of handmade and the fully industrially made. Next one. And just briefly, again, gesturing to, this is not just her art historical dialogues are not just confined to modernism, but go further back into the history of Western art history with this idea of the window and the bells. So there's a really kind of long art historical span that Yang engages with. Okay, so in closing, just a few remarks on this notion of quasi. So I mentioned already that it's, of course, a word derived from the Latin, as if, almost, being partly or almost. And in English, at least, used sort of more generally for something that is apparent, but not really seemingly resembling something, having some but not all of the features of something else. And what's important to me, what I emphasize here, is that it's a Fremdwort in German, right? It's a foreign word. We use this word Fremdwort for all of these words that I imported into the German language. So quasi is already quasi, like it's not really German. Like it's a Latin German word, and it's a Latin in French and all these other languages, other Romance languages. It becomes more complicated. It's also a very onomatopoeic word, as my son, who's a music major, reminded me. Like it sounds foreign, but also kind of cutesy. And the sound and the cutesiness of it, like, have a kind of abstract nature of it that to me also very much resonates with that insistence on abstraction and these very representational figurative objects that Haegue Yang uses. But it's very much about her engagement with art history as being one that is kind of hedging. It's taking risks, it's cautious and somewhat restrained, but it's always there. And other terms she's using, but none quite as consistently as and effectively and strongly and as strongly resonant, I think, are oblique, proximity, and similar words. So to context in closing that this is very much relevant to more broadly. Next one, please. Last image I'm showing you. So I think this notion of quasi is very much related to Haegue Yang's interest in the domestic and in the home, and in a sense, in a desire for belonging. There's a way in which she's bringing Western art history closer to herself, making it her own by kind of being in dialogue with all of these male, white, European, American artists. And somehow positioning these works somewhere between home and no home. And Haegue Yang, in her talk for us in Chicago, talked about how, quoting her, "I'm forever diaspora. I don't know original. I cannot relate to it." And that she has a desire to commit herself to a place. It's like there's a desire to commit, but never really being fully part of. That, well, resonates with me also, but that she talks quite a bit about. And I think this domestic vocabulary in her work, the work with fans, with light bulbs, with clothes racks, with blinds, with sinks, appliances, window frames, especially in this work, Salim here, really, really bring out that kind of aspect of the kind of desire for home that notion of quasi is tied to. And I think this is something that becomes very resonant the moment you see some of her work in homes, in private collections. And here's one of Haegue Yang's work that's actually installed in her home, very close to her kitchen. And that's when really the kind of strength of an artwork to me comes about is when it can hold up as art with a capital A in that kind of context of a home. This is something that resonates very strongly, I think, with our contemporary moment of a kind of global community of multitudes. We're living in an age of diaspora and migration, and this is only going to become more with global warming. And all of this, I think, very strongly resonates in Haegue Yang's work. And then secondly and lastly, this is something that is related to cultural and social politics. And she's talked about her culturally split mind with a longing for a place where, quote here too, concern remains concern without aspiring to solution, where a continued state of struggle, agony, or concern might not be a problem, but okay. So this is where I think her very abstract vocabulary that always accompanies these very recognizable objects comes in, the kind of vocabulary of openness, betweenness, always showing both sides, folding, upside down, permeable dividers, open spaces, often underneath works, a kind of sense of transparency, seeing through, loose connections like the series of vulnerable arrangements. Also the notion of movement, of wind and breezes that the fans produce, turning, changing. All of this is incredibly evocative when one thinks about it in political terms. And this abstract language is, however, as much as it has kind of strong political connotations, is always preserved as abstract, right? Which is why she talks about a kind of silent speech. I really, really like that term. And again, this resonates, last thing I say, with our very polarized politics today in the US, but also it seems increasingly here in Europe. And I'll let Haegue Yang have the last word here by quoting her on this. And how formative this actually was for her. The political environment in South Korea in which I grew up was extremely politicized and politically polarized. My family was directly committed to the leftist progressive movement. I keep a kind of territory where my position cannot be fully defined or cultivated or instrumentalized by anyone else. It's something that we need more of. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christine, for this brilliant presentation. We now open up for questions from the audience. If there is any, feel free to. We also have attendees following online, so we could also check in case there is any question for Christine.
Thank you for the interesting explanation of her work. Of course, seeing the show, I was really interested to see the work reenacted. And I missed this in your presentation. How much is the performance aspect of her work important? And
the what aspect?
The performative aspect of her sculptures. And because you talk about wind and the fans but of course, when you see the show, you really want to see it working. And
I think it's absolutely important. And from what I could tell a little bit from the photographs that I peeked into, Yilmaz is going to talk about this quite a bit. I think for me, in terms of what I was presenting, in terms of the sort of broader historical resonances of her work at this moment, with an eye to diaspora, migration, multitudes of cultures, politics, really, really important to actually see the same works or the same vocabulary of slightly reconfigured in different contexts. To me, there's something very profoundly art about that, because the moment you bring art into a new context, it's a test to what degree this artwork can actually open up to that context and something new can be added and thought about with respect to this artwork. If an artwork stays the same in all of these different contexts, it always says one thing. To me, that's usually an indicator that's not very good. But when you put your art into new contexts, either in a group exhibition, in new configurations, like Haegue Yang often does, or certain materials that reconfigured, new aspects come out that you just haven't thought about. So in that sense, the kind of performance of her own work and of her own vocabulary and the reconfigurations seems totally central. But I hadn't actually thought about it in those terms, so I really love the question, and having me think more about that. It's a really great one, because that's, of course, inherently what performance is.
Thank you. Is there another question? Maybe Hildegard, can you check if there is anything online? No? So no more questions. Thank you again, Christine, for your presentation. We will now transition to Yilmaz's presentation. So I will introduce Yilmaz with a long biography, but a brilliant one. So I will not do any cuts. So Yilmaz Dziewior was born in 1964 in Bonn, in Germany. He has been the director of the Museum Ludwig in Cologne since 2015. From 2009 to 2015, he was the director of the Kunsthaus Bregenz, a leading exhibition venue for contemporary art in Europe. As commissioner, Dziewior curated the Austrian pavilion for the 2015 Venice Biennale. Before working in Bregenz, he was the director of the Kunstverein in Hamburg for 8 years, during which time he also taught as professor of art theory at the local academy of fine arts. He was also the curator of the German pavilion for the 2022 Venice Biennale. His history with the Museum Ludwig goes back to 1996, when he worked in a freelance position till 1999. In 1997, he curated a project there with Sarah Lucas, and in 1999, he was responsible for the contemporary part of the exhibition Art Worlds in Dialogue, from Gauguin to the Global Present. He has also been a regular contributor to Art Forum in New York, Camera Austria in Graz, and also Text zur Kunst in Berlin. He has edited more than 50 books, including exhibition catalogs on 20th and 21st century, and has also contributed essays to catalogs published by the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, the Hamburger Kunsthalle, the Kunstsammlung Nordrhein-Westfalen, and also the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles. And this is something you will also witness in his presentation, but his work is characterized by a focus on social issues, including identity politics and also cultural attributions. And he has a strong interest in art from the African continent. I can cite Bodis Iseg Gingeles, Pascal Martin Taillou, Latin America and the Caribbean. I can cite Django Hernandez, Gabriel Orozco, Minerva Cuevas, and also Asia. I can cite Haegue Yang, Yan Vo, and Ai Weiwei, having curated major solo exhibitions on several of these artists. His approach to curating is interdisciplinary and collaborative, as is evident in the exhibitions and projects that he has undertaken throughout his career. Architecture, as well as theater and dance, also play an important role in his work. An analysis of the context at hand forms the foundation of his curatorial practice, which is reflected in the approaches taken by his experimental platform at the Kunsthaus Bregenz Arena in Bregenz, as well as in the insert series of exhibitions and events at the Kunstverein in Hamburg. Over the past 20 years, he has collaborated on major solo exhibitions with Yael Bartana, Cosima von Bonin, Vali Export, Aaron Farocki, Andrea Fraser, Wade Gutten, Barbara Kruger, Paul McCarthy, and Ed Rocha, among others. He has curated many group exhibitions. Amongst them, I will cite them in English to spare you my French accent. Formalism, Modern Art Today, Desired Spaces was History, That's the Way We Do It, Techniques and Aesthetics of Appropriation, Love is Colder Than Capital, and also we call it Ludwig. Welcome, Yilmaz, and I give you the mic. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Karima. Thank you also for inviting me here, and I'm really thrilled that Haegue is also here. I didn't expect her to be here. So nice and what an honor. And I have to say, it's so great to meet Christine here in person. I know her writing for so long. It makes it really hard for me to sit here after this great talk we heard, this brilliant talk. But I'm very happy to be here, and I was sort of like invited to concentrated on Warrior, Believer, and Lover version Sonic 2023, the main piece, maybe the first image. Yeah. I guess all of you, is anyone here who hasn't seen it? Yeah, everyone. Yeah, one. So everyone, which is great because it's such a difference, of course, to experience this piece in the flesh. Then I also, for me, it was really super interesting to experience in person, especially coming back to the question of performance, which was asked. When you're inside this installation, I guess you really have this impetus to interact. So I will concentrate on only on a few topics, going through comparing or taking the so-called reenactment. Haegue used the word for her sonic version Sonic, and to compare it or to show you images and maybe later talk with you more about Warrior, Believer, and Lover from 2011, which you could say the piece you see here is what Haegue used as a reenactment or as a version Sonic or Sonic version. And I think I'm actually a bit intimated to be after your talk because it was such a great talk. But on the other side, I'm also quite happy to follow you, because what I liked also about, among several things about your talk, was how you presented us the revisiting of Haegue, revisiting other artists, or putting her work in relation to other historical artists. And I try to show you in my brief presentation here a revisiting of Haegue, her own work, to revisit it and also to develop it, not necessarily further, but to comment on her own work, which I think is which I like a lot. And I think a term I would be interested in this presentation is the term contradiction and duality, because just by coming back to one's own work, as Haegue did here with Warrior, Believer, Lover, the version Sonic, she creates sort of like a duality. You have the work by 2011 and the work by 2023. So you have already two works relating to installation, relating to each other. And I also see not only a continuation, but I also see sort of like a self-contradiction in the works itself. So first I go, here you see the piece. First I go with you through the different, so the next one, please. I like to show you, because I also, maybe for the online audience who didn't see the show yet, go with you through briefly through this installation, Warrior, Believer, Lover version Sonic 2023. So the next one. And these and what I would invite you is read the titles of the single sculptures carefully, because they they're really telling, like sonic totem robot, forward, askew, and sideways. And then the next one. Yeah, the next one. And here you see already the performative, you know, on the one hand, you see it's important to see a person next to the work to get a sense of the scale. But you also see already sort of like this interactive moment, which is suggested by the sculpture, which look very creature like living figures, though, and that's what I think is the interesting one of the interesting contradiction, that you have this illusion of nature, this illusion of liveness, which is with the plants, for example, or also like with the sonic, with the sound. But at the same time, these are artificial plants, and it's interesting to just resonates this idea of artificiality in the context of the art world, how Haegue is abstracting, I mean, on the one hand, quoting very literally, but then abstracting nature in her work. Then the next one. And we go so, and you have the sonic female natives. You will encounter the female natives later. I go backwards actually because I wanted to start with the show here. Later I will show you the work Warrior, Believer, Lover from 2011 at the Kunsthaus Bregenz. The next one. And also here you have spine spell, sonic spine bell, the next one. Sonic stone dance, angular circle. So in the title already you have a description on the formal abstract language, and then also stone dance. I don't know how you, but for me it really resonates like ancient periods or ancient times. The next one, and then the next one. Yeah, the next one. And here you have the sonic medicine men. Also these, not these creatures actually, but what I would call the duality, the former, the predecessors of the medicine men we will encounter later in 2000, from 2011. The next one. Yeah, so this just a reminder of what you've seen, what most of you've seen here. Now I want to really briefly introduce you to the exhibition from 2011 at the Kunsthaus Bregenz by Haegue. And I remember when Haegue was preparing here the S.M.A.K exhibition, she told me, Yilmaz, you really have to come to see the exhibition. And I now totally understand why, because this re-encounter of her own work, re-encounter from 2011, I think is really super interesting. Just to give you an idea about the next one, about the exhibition. The Kunsthaus Bregenz, for the ones who do not know it, it's a quite characteristic building done by Peter Zumthor with concrete walls. There are 3 levels, and usually artists are invited to produce new works for this venue. It's a Kunsthalle. And so also when I invited Haegue, we were talking about that she could produce a new piece. This is already now 12 years ago. And so Haegue was in a different stage of her career, one could say, 12 years ago. She was already very, very experienced, but of course, in the last 12 years, a lot of things happened. And I think this, at least what she told me also at the time, was sort of like important, this exhibition and these new commissions she did for the exhibition. And as much as I like to do new productions, I think for the audience as a curator or as a director, I think it's also for me important to introduce an artist. You know, I can't take for granted my knowledge or the knowledge of my colleagues about an artist, but I like to introduce the artist more in a, if possible, in a broader sense. So doing surveys, and I thought it's also nice here in Bregenz that we started, the first floor was a survey, a tiny survey of Haegue's work, so that the audience would understand where these new works, you know, what the ground is, the intellectual or aesthetic ground for the new commission. So you have here also the quasi-MB you see in the back there, the Brothers reference. And here you see the beautiful collages out of the envelopes Christine was talking earlier, and this shelves which are sort of like household or industrial, sort of like furniture, but at the same time, if you think about what you've seen earlier, the Sol LeWitt or other minimal conceptual artists, of course, also reference to them, and making them, I don't know if you can see this, but they're not straight in a way, but they are awkward. And we also, the next one, we also showed video works, and that's what I like about the exhibition here at the S.M.A.K. You also have like this really, I would call them mesmerizing, beautiful installation, which are immersive. You go inside this installation and you have the installation all around you, but you also, they are, there is sort of like this juxtaposition of these two video works also here in the exhibition, which also gives you a totally different speed. You know, you have to calm down, to sit down, and to get also just by the voiceover, and it takes 70 minutes, so over 1 hour to go through all the video. You get into a intellectual and political discourse. Christina was mentioning by storytelling, by the voiceover, and this was also here in Bregenz that we were showing this earlier works of Haegue together with the video works where she which were about her being in Korea and experience different, but similar like here also experience different quarters, for example, of so the next one. Yeah, we also showed on this floor the so-called storage piece, which is a piece where Haegue put a lot, like several hundred works of hers together as one piece, and this was also part of the show. So it started already with quite a dense, a lot of information, and on the first floor, so you would really get an idea about the practice and also the very different aspects of the practice of Haegue Yang. And the next step, you would see then on the next floor, you would see then this new commissioned blind works, and we heard already very interesting references from Christina about the possible layers of the blind pieces, so of presenting, of hiding. And here, the next one, please. You see also how architectural these blinds were. Haegue developed these blinds into the space, and there were also scents. You know, you would smell. They were also part of it, and the piece was called Cittadella, So like sort of like a castle or like a yeah, and so you the next one, if we go back and go back again. Maybe so there were different light situations. I don't know if you can already with these two images. Not only that the blinds were most of them were silver, but as you see up there, there were also some abstract colors or abstract pattern, would the wrong word, but abstract fields as part of the silver monochromes. The next one. And this is what Haegue sort of like is revisiting here in the main hall. And I will show you now the different elements of this installation. And here at the S.M.A.K, Warrior, Believer, Lover version Sonic 2023, there are 17 sort of like single sculptures. The one I show you here from Bregenz, there were 33. So I think it's interesting, almost the double amount. And what I like about the revisiting of Haegue's own revisiting here, her sculptures, is that usually the expectation is the further an artist go in his or her career, the works become bigger, more, and I like that Haegue's in her revisiting early sculpture reduces her work, or you could also say concentrates her work. And as you see, as she uses, she quotes her own titles, like with female natives, we will encounter will encounter the medicine men. And so, but she puts a sonic, or she adds in the title the sonic because of this element of sound, which interestingly enough, you don't hear the sound of the bells. You imagine it, but what you do hear is, and this at the end of my talk I will come to this more. You do hear Le Sacre du Printemps by Igor Stravinsky, so a very iconic, important, and also for music history important composition of classical music. So I go now with you through the different sculptures, and you see here it's also interesting at the S.M.A.K we have the sonic sculptures, and in Bregenz Haegue introduced the so-called light sculptures. So the next one. So you see here, so that was on the first floor, was sort of like we could use a word quasi-survey, so a small survey, but not being a survey, but not but also refusing maybe too much, but also not being a survey. Then there was the Cittadella, the big blinds installation, which had like this sort of like this architectural moment where you as a visitor would go into this fortress and would experience walking around in this immersive installation. And then you would go upstairs on the third floor and encounter these creatures, which was, and you also see maybe here how idiosyncratic this building is. You have this concrete floor, you have this this concrete walls, this terrazzo floor, and then you had this glass ceiling, and but in each on each floor, the light atmosphere and in general, the whole atmosphere was very different. On the first floor, you would be sort of like introduced, you would read, you would watch the video, you would you know, get sort of like an introduction. Then you would have like this immersive feeling often, where the architecture is, you know, even more, the regular architecture is not so visible because the light is down and you have the blinds, but the artwork by Haegue as architecture is very physical. You experience it. And then on the third floor, at the end sort of like of the exhibition, you would encounter these creature, and it's interesting. And I have the same experience, though different, as here, which one would have there, that you would really have the feeling to encounter creatures. I mean, we talk about sculptures here, right? And there are, you could say, abstract sculptures, but not only because of the title, but just because standing in opposite of it, you would have this yeah, you would have like a personal relation to these creatures, which were actually abstract sculptures made out of so-called, what we heard earlier, ready-mades. So just to give you a few impressions, the next one. And so this is a duo, and it's really nice that that Christina was talking so much also about pattern and about abstraction, and also about crafts. And I think all this you have already here. This is one piece, this duo. You have all these notions already in this piece. Then the next one. Here you get an idea. So this 33 sculptures, it was, you would meet quite a lot of creatures there, because everyone was sort of like, also if they would appear as a duo or in more or 4 or 6 creatures which would form one group, every time you would really encounter and also what we have also here at the S.M.A.K, that you have this idea of performance, and this is especially because the sculptures have this the roles beneath, so you can move them, which you have here, but which were in Bregenz even more visible, as you see, because Haegue used this racks, right? But this racks where you put your clothes on to move in shops, for example. She used this racks which become very anthropomorphic. Then the next one. And so you have, for example, similar also what you have here at the S.M.A.K, the wigs, the gray wigs, the black wigs, and or the really colorful one. And this was you had the feeling of a very totem, that you would encounter a totem or a ritual object. And I think it's also interesting that some of them then were called medicine men. So Haegue refers on the one hand to indigenous practices or to a vocabulary, a formal vocabulary from arts and crafts or from indigenous arts and crafts, but contradicts at the same time, because what you see here are all industrial found, or she looked for it, found objects. And so you have like this idea of paganism, but at the same time it's really very Western, found here in shops and in the US or in Korea or in Berlin, and put them together. The next one. Now I'd like to quote also Haegue here. You can read it. Very ordinary things, even domestic one put, because I asked Haegue that the space of the Kunsthaus Bregenz, it's actually can be very be alienating. When you're inside, it can be a very cold space, even a rigid place, the architecture of Peter Zumthor at Kunsthaus Bregenz. And I asked her that by bringing all these household materials and these materials related to the human, like the wig and the plants, also there were plastic plants, to introduce this into this machine, you could say, which is the Kunsthaus Bregenz, in a way to introduce it there. She sort of like domestifies it. We heard it also, the question of gender, that the house traditionally was related to women. So all these aspects, she brings it, but at the same time contradicts it, because she shows the warrior. But at the same time, she also shows the believer and lover, like really extreme figures. And I'd like to the quote here by Haegue, where she put this together. Then the next one. Just a reminder to relate this. Then the next one. And yeah, what I'm very interested in is the what she calls the female natives, because what we heard before, like this idea about cultural identity, and I liked when Christine liked very much when she quotes Haegue to be for ever diaspora, that you, so that for me, it's interesting that that Haegue, on the one hand, you know, reflects and really works on the cultural identity of her artworks in a way, you know, by adapting, by learning, but at the same time, and that what I would call the contradiction, but at the same time, sort of like not refusing, but, you know, transforming this working of her question of identity. That was also the last quote by Christina. She quoted Haegue, that she is searching, that she is looking for, but she, I would say, is aware that this will be an ongoing process, and it's good not to be aware that this process won't finish and that this process won't come to a result. The next one. And here you have the female natives, and I also you see Haegue's relation to language. Also, you have like always the sort of like this group characterized as female natives, but then saturation of the season, oratoricals, possessed hillbilly. So like, and it's the same maybe like what we experience with the quasi, that it is that the words or the subdescriptions refer to scientific or to classifications, but but then with hillbilly also bring or possessed hillbilly a humorous aspect into this classification she first offers or opens. The next one. And I think it would be just also beautiful, maybe a next piece, a word piece would be just the titles of Haegue's, because I think they really have sort of like a poetic quality. And they're like, if you just fruitful glow, maturing, lunar calendar, if you see this, preparing this talk, and I was going through this, and I thought it's really very beautiful how she described it. And at the same time, they also have a function, the titles, because they bring you, they connect you to the work, and you look at the title, and then you want to find where do you find the fruits and the glow, for example, in the there are the maturing. Of course, you may think first, oh, that is like an autumn plant. You know, the plants, the leaves are already brown, and so on. So they like little. You know, you get something that you get into it, but at the same time, they keep you out. The next one. They're almost, as you see here, hairy, bloody. It's only this sculpture has the title Hairy Bloody. It's because it's connected to the visual language, and also to the concrete elements Haegue uses. Hairy noble, and I remember the conversation I had with Haegue, and you know, my hair gets gray, and I don't like it. But Haegue said, you know, because I was puzzled, why is this gray hair noble? I think it's old. But of course, one understands that there is this concept, or is this idea um, about maturity, and actually. And maybe it's also a personal thing with Haegue, that she feels attracted, or at least that's what she told me in the interview. She feels attracted to gray hair because of maybe the wisdom. It's cliche, but still, of the wisdom, or the experience, the life experience, connecting with it. And I think it's a really, really beautiful piece on its own. But I think it becomes even more beautiful with the title Hairy Noble, and the hairy mat joint is also great. Of course, you think about, or I do at least, not only because I come from Cologne, but about carnival, or about, you know, like costumes, or becoming different personas through the different weeks, using this different wigs, the transgression of an identity by you know, changing your hair, changing your the way you look. The next one. Yeah, Out of the Cave is also really great. When we come to the end, to Stravinsky. Yeah, next one. And you see when we talked earlier about pattern and crafts, the circular flats really quotes quite literally the different crafts of you know, how to work with textile and with wool, and combining it with this wax, with this industrial found objects. Next one. And here you remember the totem Roberts. You had here the sonic totem Roberts, and I think it's interesting in a way that here, you know, when Haegue revisited her this piece from 2011, revisited it, or as she says, reenacted it. The Roberts, they get a different meaning or function, one should say. If you see here, the Roberts, also you have like the different from household, or different and the light bulbs, or the grids. And here so I would say they have necessarily no other function than the other creatures in Warrior, Believer, and Lover from 2011. But in 12 years later, in revisiting her piece, the robots, they become sort of like they light the sculptures. You remember seeing in the space, they have lamps and they look sort of like IT, and they give light to the sculptures. So sort of like they are, on the one hand, say they are us, the spectator, looking at the creatures, but at the same time they put them into the limelight. They put the light on the other creatures. So she gives them a function. The next one. Yeah, we've seen these before, but it's also nice, I think, to really see the next one. Next one. And you see this whole variety, and I think that is, and that's also why I understand, or why, that Haegue as an artist, reenacts this piece, because it's so full of ideas already, and also full of references, cultural references, art historical references, that it totally makes sense, to redevelop it, but not necessarily make it bigger or make it more, but maybe to concentrate and to transform it. The next one. And the next one. And here we have again the stone dance shade. The next one. So I'm coming to an end to compare these two installation, and in Bregenz it was that there was 3 times a day warrior, believer, and lover. It was already quite, it wasn't dark, but it was, it wasn't as bright as on the other, on the first floor, so that you could see the bulbs, or that they would be more present. But 3 times a day, the light would go out, would be shut down, and only the bulbs. And then there would be, and that was very, and we will hear this later. It was very dramatic. You would hear Le Sacre du Printemps, and I think it's also interesting and telling that how Haegue does it here. Here it's 5 times that the that Sacre du Printemps is in Bregenz. It was the morning, noon, and then in the evening it was played. And here it's played, and that I guess that will be very specific times, because these times are different in each city, to Islamic prayer times. So it will be in dawn, noon, afternoon, sunset, at evening. But it's very precise. I didn't find out in here in Ghent, but there are not at there on very precise times where you would pray, and these and at this time the Sacre du Printemps will be played, and yeah, and the Sacre du Printemps was a piece by Stravinsky from 1913, and I will show you later. And I show, but of course there are no, not of course, but there are no documentation. The next one. I mean, there are some stills from this performance, which was a big scandal in Paris in 1913. You know, the audience would leave the concert. It was really almost like a riot, like really a very strong reaction to it. And but what I will show you is a reenactment, one could say, 100 years later, in 2013. So 2 years after we showed Warrior, Believer, and Lover at the Kunsthaus Bregenz. 2 years later, for the 100th anniversary in Paris, it was shown. The next one. You see another still, and then the next one, please. That will be the video. So just a brief and for me, and I talked also actually with my young colleague Joanne Rodriguez at the Museum Ludwig, who I also have to thank. She put the presentation together, and we were actually both watching this video. Were both in a way very puzzled, because we thought, okay, we understand in 1913, or I think we understand how Stravinsky with the Ballet Russe originally uses sort of like the pagan spring sacrifice ritual as a contradiction, or as a as a strong force, or I would use the word rebellion against so-called avant-garde, and it has its value for this, and I totally understand. Um, and even 100 years later, 2013, when this reenactment, was shown, it was possible to show this and to bring this on stage, but now, only 10 years later, I think it would be much more complicated, and I think it's interesting and could be an interesting also discussion also in relating to how Haegue deals with this question. Here, I would say what you would now call cultural appropriation of the pagan or of the Slavic pagan rituals is so literal, and it's so quoting that for me, watching it now, and also, as I said, for my colleague, watching it now, it's really disturbing, but not disturbing as it was disturbing with when Stravinsky showed it 110 years ago, but on another way. And I think that's and I also close with Haegue. We didn't know that Haegue is here, but I also close with a quote by Haegue. The next slide, and the last slide, please. And I think the quality of Haegue's work is that she, on the one hand, I don't want to sound romantic, but on the one hand, I see the real sort of like struggle or the real commitment Haegue puts in her work to reflect a question of cultural belonging or of cultural transformation. And I think that is really a quality. And I think if Stravinsky would do Sacre de Printemps, and there are really great interpretations of this piece, I'm quite sure he would also do it not from the music, but with the Ballet Russe. He would do it differently. But for me, it was important also to show this to give you an idea how Haegue transformed this. And this time it's not revisiting herself, but early time revisiting Sacre du Printemps, how she transformed it and brings it into a contemporary language which you cannot pinhold. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yilmaz, for your presentation. We also now open up for any questions from the audience. If you might have. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for that. Really nice review of sort of your relationship as well to Haegue's work. I think my question sort of comes around thinking about the nature of mobility that the wheels imply. But then also a question around the singular and the multiple, because you showed a number, especially in the totem works, you seem to show, you showed a number of them, and then they were together in one space on that third floor. And especially seeing that video in the end, I'm sort of wondering what your take is on the potential political implications of those objects having mobility, having potential anthropomorphic character, but also being together sometimes, but often photographed sort of apart as well. Yeah, and so I guess I was also thinking about the work of Anna Imhoff and the notions of mobility there and of crowds moving or encountering crowds of performers, and what that might imply politically too. So I was wondering if you had sort of thought that through.
Thank you very much. Yep, the question of singularity and the double, for example, which occurs in the work of Haegue, for me is sort of like a political question, because it is sort of like making up a reflection of the opposite of you, you know, like of your neighbor. It's always sort of like a by creating more than one, by creating a duo, you're already creating a dialogue, which I think is always a political question. And the question of mobility, you have already, yeah, as I mentioned, in the sculptures, combined here, combined with sounds. And for me, it refers on the one hand to Haegue's personal, but I mean, she's here for Haegue's personal situation. She just came in from Seoul, I think yesterday or today, and like she really moves between like the different, and not only personally as being born in Korea, working in Germany, but spending half of the year in Korea, but also like being part of her art practice. I only know very few artists, maybe Jan Vo, or but really very few artists who exhibit in different cultural contexts as Haegue do. I think that she in Australia, in Asia, Latin America, and it's really and for me it's really part of the practice, like you know, moving around, but at the same time, looking at this figures I showed here, who are culturally loaded, like with exoticizing, for example. And I remember a discussion I had with Haegue where she was talking about exoticizing herself as sort of like, not herself, like you know, like being aware of the exoticizing from the outside, being in Germany, and sort of like her reaction and sort of like her productive struggle with this. And of course, this is deeply a political question. And I think, as Christina said earlier, like with the current political situation, where, as you mentioned, global warming, that there will be more, you know, movement, not willingly movement, and I think that this cultural movement is also part, not only as of her person, but in her work a lot, as the language of the work. And I think with when you refer to Anne Imhoff, it's I'm a fan, I have to say, but still it's so different. It's um, it's much more in her time, and I don't mean this with any judging. It's very, it feels very, very now, the work of Anne Imhoff, I would say. Also the language, the clothes, the fashion, the everything. I remember going into the German pavilion when she did the pavilion, I felt really, actually, or maybe already 2 years earlier or so. So it was already a portrait of the time, but very fixed in a way to the time. And with Haegue, the movements she indicates, the like for Anne Imhoff, performance is a crucial part, and that's also, I think, one of her main contribution, how she developed performance. And with Haegue, performance is part of the work, but it's more to activate her work. You know, you see documentation of her work, for example, when her assistant or so, they move the thing so that you understand what is part of the work, but not necessarily executed in the work. You actually are sometimes allowed to touch, for example, the bell sculptures, but it's actually not necessary to see the actual movement, because you see with Anne, you have to see the movement and to experience the movement, and a video doesn't fulfill also the quality or the strength, because it's a totally different. It's much more, I would say, about authenticity, about directness. Yeah, and it's a very different take, I would say.
Thank you. We could take one more question if there is. Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much, both of you, for your wonderful presentations. It's not really a question. I think it's more of a comment, or a comment on the way in which your presentations and also the visit to the exhibition 2 days ago has raised, this word just keeps coming up over and over in my head in terms of the way that art history is narrated and the ways in which artists can interfere with it, but also in the ways with which the work is operating, in terms of refraction, a kind of redirection of the waves of sound, or the waves of light, or the waves of thought. And I was thinking about it specifically because you showed the documentation of the 1913 and the 2013 versions of the S.A.K. But when Christine and I were in the exhibition on Friday, we hit the QR code 2 minutes before the S.A.K. was about to play. And when it started, I immediately thought of Pina Bausch and Wuppertal, immediately, even though there were these other more, let's say, literal references to the iconography of the original. Anyway, refraction, I can't get it out of my head, and I thank you very much for that.
Thank you for the comment. Thanks. Is there any additional question? If not, I want to thank again Christine and Yilmaz for your presentations. It was really amazing, and I'm glad also that Haegue is here with us today and could witness with us collectively. I just want to indicate you that we will conclude this series of talks on September the 3rd with an artist talk with Haegue here at S.M.A.K. So I invite you to come again if you can make it. Otherwise, I wish you all a good Sunday and thank you again. Thanks.